Libo.
Hi, my name is Samat Galimov. I am an entrepreneur and a former CTO for the independent news media outlet Meduza, and you are listening to Launching Tomorrow, a podcast brought to you by Libo Studio. In this show, I explore technologies that shape the world we live in and talk to people who develop them. In this episode, I talked to Isabella Fernandez, the executive director of the Tor project. Some people may think that Tor browser is synonymous with the dark web and gives you access to websites that sell all sorts of illegal stuff. While this can be true to some extent, Tor and its onion routing technology is actually an incredibly important technology. It allows us to create a web within the web that can be neither controlled nor blocked by any authorities. It's a real underground internet where all users remain anonymous. It helps people from all around the world to bypass blockings and censorship and access information. Me and Isabella talked about how onion routing works and how Tor achieves such a high level of security.
My name is Cory Doctorow. I am a science fiction writer and an activist. I work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I maintain a blog at pluralistic.net.
Kind of the entry remark from me is that a month ago, there was a very bad data breach from the biggest Russian delivery service called Yandex Food. And activists used this data to track home addresses of famous individuals, and some journalists even found Putin's daughter's personal home address. It caused a very large public backlash and provoked discussions about privacy. So I'd like to talk about personal data. In Russian, we use term personal data, персональные данные. I think the closest in English is PII, personal identifiable information. Could you please explain what does that mean?
So personal identifying information is a term that is superficially pretty easy. It's just what it says on the tin, information that identifies you personally, and in particular, things that might be sensitive. So a simple example would be your home address, or your HIV status, or your sexual orientation, or whether or not you got caught cheating on an exam in university, right? These are all things that are personal, they identify you, and they're potentially compromising. The reality is, PII is a very subtle and slippery concept because, as we see with open source intelligence actions, as well as with identity theft, that toxicity of a given piece of information increases with aggregation. The problem is that even very innocuous pieces of information, so here's an example from the United Kingdom. They have a National Health Service, the NHS, and it wanted to enable researchers to study prescribing patterns among doctors in the health service. And so it made an anonymized health data set that had a number assigned to each patient, so a random number, what prescription they were given, when, and by what doctor. And so this is something that seems on its face to be very low risk of re-identification. And then there's a taxi company, a private taxi company, that suffered a breach that exposed all of the rides that were given over the same period as this prescribing data. And now what I can do is I can say, which people took a taxi to the hospital every time this patient was given a prescription? So every time, so say someone was given 6 prescriptions and only one taxi went to the hospital on those days at exactly that time. So that's a merger, right? And so we merge those two pieces of data. Okay, so we still don't know who it is because all we have is the addresses. So we know what address the car left from, and we know that they went to the hospital, and we can guess that that person got the prescription. But then there are other databases of who lives where. So maybe Yandex Delivery has a breach, and it says this person lives at this address. So now we merge 3 databases, and we put them all together, and now we can say who it was, where they went, and what medicine they were taking.
Oh my God.
And the problem is that for the NHS to sufficiently mask the PII in its data set, it has to be able to predict in the future all possible breaches, or not even breaches, releases. because maybe there was another release of another set of data that could be cross-referenced to this set of data. And so you have implicit data, you have explicit data, you have aggregated data, you have anonymized data, and all of these kinds of data are on their own maybe robust. So there's one piece of implicit information, but on its own, it's not very compromising. But then if there's a breach later on, or a planned release later on, then that can be extremely damaging. Now, here is the great paradox, which is that the commercial surveillance companies, the companies that sell ad targeting, which are the source of the most information, they like to hold on to all their information forever because they think it will help them target ads. And they have dossiers on people who've been using the internet for 20 years. They have 20 years worth of data on your online habits. Amazon, Google, Yandex, they all do, right? They have all of this data and they sit on it. But the one thing it's not very good for is advertising, because knowing a 20-year-old fact about your consumption habits has very, very narrow applications in advertising. There are a few, right? Like if you know 20 years ago I put a new roof on my house, then you know that it's about time for me to put another roof on my house. If you know like 20 years ago I had a baby, you know it's time to advertise going to college products to parents who want to send their kids to college, like decorations for their dorm room. But most of that information is of extremely low value to commercial concerns. It helps criminals. It helps authoritarian governments. It helps identity thieves. Doesn't really help advertisers.
So my question is, why do they store all that data?
One reason is they can. It just doesn't cost them anything, right? They just sit on these hard drives full of data that are cheap to maintain. And they think that maybe in the future, they'll find a use for it. Like maybe in the future, they will dream up some subtle correlation between data. So Google, very famously, they did this once. They said, I bet that a week before the government knows that there has been a flu outbreak, that more people are searching on flu-like symptoms in that neighborhood. And I bet we can predict where the flu will be. This was long before COVID. This was 10 years ago. That we can predict where the flu will be by watching flu-like searches, sore throat, stuffy nose.
That sounds really good. It's logical.
Yeah, it sounds really good. And they were able to go back and try and validate the hypothesis. They went back and they said, okay, what does the data tell us about where people had the flu? And what does our search data tell us about it? So they're like, maybe we'll have a good idea. It turned out that the flu data was a mirage. It only worked retrospectively, and prospectively it didn't work. But they're convinced that it might, right? So that's one reason. It doesn't cost them anything, and maybe it gets them something. And so I think that all of us can understand. I think everybody has a drawer in their kitchen that's full of, weird things that they didn't want to throw away. I have these boxes of USB cables for devices I don't own anymore.
I could make myself to throw away that cables.
Yeah, exactly. We all know what this is like. Okay. But then there's this other thing, which is that big tech actually sells to advertisers the idea that the data makes them really good selling ads, at making ads effective, and that in particular, the more data you have, the better you are at selling products. So, the Google and Facebook, they're very powerful and they make a lot of money. And partly that's because they control about 80% of the online ad market. But it's not just how much market they have, it's that they charge more, right? It costs more to run an ad with Google than it does to run an ad to the same users with another search engine, with DuckDuckGo or Yandex or whatever, because Google has convinced advertisers that its ads work better. And one of the ways that it says its ads work better and that it has this durable advantage is because it has a data advantage. It has 20 years of longitudinal data, which allows it to target users in ways that someone who's only been in business for 2 years can't. And that claim is very overblown, but it's very important to Google. It's very important to Facebook. It's really key to their commercial story. It's also key to why investors don't invest in competitors.
I wonder, is there any data on this, like scientific research on this?
About the efficacy?
Efficacy of Google ads versus different search engine ads, etc.?
Well, the problem is that they're very secretive. But there's a wonderful book about this that came out in either 2020 or 2021 called Subprime Attention Crisis by Tim Hwang. And Hwang is an ex-ad tech executive. And he talks about how within the ad tech industry, they kind of know that it doesn't do what they say it does. So for one thing, about half of the ads they say that they're showing to people never get seen. Right? They're like, it's click fraud, it's ad fraud, it's technical errors, whatever. But also, there have been these incredibly big experiments, kind of natural experiments. So Procter & Gamble, which is one of the two packaged goods monopolists in the world, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, the two big packaged good companies. They were spending $100 million a year on online advertising. And one year they decided to spend nothing. So from 100 million to zero, guess how much their sales fell? Not at all.
Oh my God. So you've said that they store enormous amounts of data. Do these companies secure this data at all? Do they work on that kind of?
Yeah, they say they do. They've had some pretty big breaches. All of them have had really big breaches. The one that I think is most damning is Amazon.
Could you tell a little bit about the story? Because I don't think my audience remembers that.
Yeah. I don't know if your audience will have access to Amazon, but in the West, Amazon is is considered to be, if nothing else, a very reliable company. So I worry about giving up my home address because I don't want weirdos showing up at my door, and I work from home. So everything has to be sent to my address. And I knew about all these breaches. So I rent a mailbox that's like 2 kilometers away, and I go there every day. It's like my daily walk and get my mail. But the one thing I don't do that with is Amazon.
You trust Amazon.
I got to trust them. Plus, we get our cat food delivered by Amazon. I don't want to carry cat food under my arms 2 kilometers. And so we get everything delivered by Amazon. We thought they would be safe. And then there was a big report after a couple of giant breaches that they suffered. And what the article showed was that Amazon is very committed to product innovation. And they have lots of little teams, hundreds of teams that are coming up with cool ideas to make Amazon work better. And you can see that it works, right? They actually, I think they're a company that has a lot of problems, but I don't think one of those problems is a lack of innovation. Yeah. And in order to not slow those teams down, they had no internal controls on who could copy their customer data. None on who could do it. And Amazon gathers a lot of data. They're a very data-driven company. So if you own an Amazon Kindle, everything is recorded, like how many times you touch the screen, where you touch the screen, which words you search on, how many pages you read. So they have lots of this data. And the teams were just able to just make copies. And they didn't even know. They had no system of controls to even keep track of who made copies or what happened to those copies. And as a result, they had no chief security officer. Because whenever a chief security officer would go to work for Amazon, the first thing they would say is, you have to stop this. This is a nightmare. And Amazon would say, shut up and let our teams get on with their job. Your job is not to tell us to shut down our innovation engine. Your job is to make it safe. And they would say, well, you can't make it safe if you don't have controls. And so the way that they eventually solved this, they promoted someone from within the company who had no security experience. And that person was the only chief security officer they could find who wouldn't tell them that they had to stop because he didn't know what he was doing. And then eventually he quit because even he could see that there was a real problem here.
That sounds crazy.
Amazon, you would think, would have an element of risk aversion when it came to mishandling customer data. But the internal politics of Amazon, there's a good Russian word for this, the Kremlinology of Amazon, trying to understand what's going on inside this big secretive institution, is very hard. And I think that, in general, big institutions, even ones that are very effective, if they're not exposed to scrutiny, can do a lot of things wrong.
If you circle back to the data breaches, how often do they happen?
Well, we don't know because they don't tell us. Like a lot of the times we find out about data breaches because they show up on the internet. There's not much. I mean, there are these like obligations to report in different jurisdictions. California's got one where the firm has to contact you and tell you that it's breached your data. But those notifications are often, charitably, you would say that they're just chaotic. They're made so obscure that it's very hard to tell. And then, of course, one of the things that spammers do or phishers do is they send you fake breach notifications. Click here to claim your your $2. I in fact have been getting a ton of these. So we had some alcohol delivered by a company called Drizzly. So one of the other companies we trusted with our home address, because that's the other thing, is if you're going to get food delivered, you can't get your pizza delivered to the mailbox 2 kilometers away. So, it's like they're these very hard to avoid risks. So Drizzly had a breach. Our home address was in it. And we have gotten so many notifications from Drizzly about the fact that we're owed, $11 as part of our compensation for a class action suit against them. Some of them are just like very badly written and look like phishing emails, but I'm sure some of them are phishing emails. Some of them have to be phishing emails. That if I'm smart enough to think of making them into a phishing email, someone out there is smart enough to make it into a phishing email, right? And especially when you're talking about a certain kind of breach, when you're talking about breaches that came from the user's own vulnerability. So the user made a mistake. The user wasn't technologically sophisticated. They trusted a company that was untrustworthy to begin with. Contacting those people means that you're contacting people who are suckers, right? Who lack the sophistication and who are also traumatized. So, one of the things that those Nigerian scammers do is they circulate lists of scam victims to other scammers who specialize in a different scam, which is, I am the FBI and I know you were scammed and I'm here to help you get your money back.
That is soul crushing.
It really is. It's really terrible.
What are the consequences of data breaches for regular people? And you just named one, which is literally soul crushing. But from what I hear, usually each individual data breach is not a big deal. But once they got combined...
Yeah, it gets combined. So, there was a rash, I think it was 2016, in both London and New York, people whose houses were stolen and sold while they were on vacation.
What?
By people who combined breach data to apply for duplicate deeds of their homes.
This is crazy.
It's a very specific set of data that you need, but it's not a secret set of data, right? If you call your local property registry now and say, I have lost the deed to my home, I need a duplicate deed, they will tell you what papers you need. And then if some of those papers, like say you need a copy of your birth certificate, you can call the Register of Births and you can say, I have lost my birth certificate. What data do I need? And they will tell you what data you need. And so you can just, if the reward on the other side is big enough, it's worth going through all of those steps.
That is crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Could you remember some other breaches which are really sticking out?
I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, the house one was the one that blew me away. There was a rash of sextortion, which was targeted at teenage girls, and they would remotely operate. So they would exploit a vulnerability, let them remotely operate the camera and microphone on their device. They would capture inadvertent nudes. So just like people getting dressed in the morning in their bedroom. Then they would they would steal all their passwords, their social media passwords and so on. And then they would contact them and they would say, unless you perform sex acts on camera for me, I will dump these to your social media accounts because I have the passwords for them.
And then they will record those too, of course.
And then they record those and use those as more. And the thing that broke the most prolific guy who had targeted hundreds of people, including many minor children, was that he went after a former Miss America or Miss Teen USA. Because she had institutional support, she was able to get the FBI involved, and they found this guy. And so, he had done this to hundreds of people.
It's soul crushing that you have to be someone important to be noticed and to be taken care of.
Yeah. The worst of these, I will tell you, is when we emigrated from the United Kingdom to the United States, we had a shipping container. And to go through customs, you have to give the shipping broker your passport information. And of course, you have the container delivered to your house. Because again, you don't want to get the container delivered 2 kilometers away and carry it home, right? So there are people who call themselves shipping marketing agents who go to the Port of Los Angeles, and the waybills on the containers are on the outside. They're public information.
Oh my God.
And that waybill has the shipping address and the passport number. And so one day I typed my passport number into a search engine just to see what came up. And there were hundreds of databases that had my home address and my passport number linked in the database. Now, thankfully, my passport is expired and we moved. But I could not get that data removed from the internet.
Who are the people to steal our data from companies?
There's a mix, and it's become very specialized. It's become a kind of vertical industry where you have people who specialize in breaching, people who specialize in exploiting, people who specialize in selling, and so on. And so on the breach side, you have a mix. On the one hand, you have professionals who develop breaching tools. And so they don't necessarily breach themselves, although they might. But what they're interested in is doing what Kaspersky does, or Avast, or any of these other companies, which is that they look at commercial products and they try to see if there are defects in them. And so there are people who just investigate defects. They stockpile defects and then they exploit them, right? They write code that allows you to abuse these defects to go and attack someone who's using the service.
They sound like a good guys who find bugs in the software.
It all depends on who's doing it, right? And this brings us to a very important point, which is that there are a lot of companies who say that if you discover a defect in their product, the only legal option for you should be to go to them and tell them about the defect, and then wait for them to decide when to disclose it. And what we know is that when you do that, companies sometimes never disclose it. They just decide it's not a big deal, right? Or they wait because, next week is the quarterly report and they don't want to surprise the shareholders, and so they wait. Well, in that week, maybe people get breached. Maybe bad things happen. So just to close off that thing, everybody is looking for defects. Good guys, bad guys, spies, government agencies, tech companies, they're all looking for defects. And the NSA, they developed this doctrine about the defects they found called NOBUS, which stands for no one but us, which means that they thought they would find some of the defects they found were so subtle that no one but them would ever find them. And so they kept them back.
So they think they are the smartest guys in the room.
Yeah, exactly. So they kept them back so that they could attack their adversaries. And what we discovered, because there were a couple of big breaches, the Vault 6 breach and the Vault 7 breach, that breached a bunch of NSA cyber weapons and CIA cyber weapons. And what we saw from these is that the defects that they had been hoarding were being independently rediscovered at the rate of about 20% per year. So in any given year, a NOBUS defect had about a 1 in 5 chance of being independently discovered by criminals and used to attack the people the NSA was supposed to be protecting. And so this argument that we should keep the defects secret because the bad guys, they won't find them, it's just not true, right? Like empirically, it doesn't hold up. And importantly, those defects may not be unknown. They just may be unknown to customers.
Cory, it sounds like most of the breaches are happening because of the vulnerabilities. Is that certainly true? Because my assessment was that most of the breaches happen because of disgruntled employees or employees who were bribed by someone.
So I don't think we can assess. I mean, there's actually a third possibility. So one is insider threats, and the other one is social engineering. And I think the reality is it's all three.
Could you tell more about social engineering, please?
So social engineering is I call you up and I say, hi, I am your bank and I'm going to foreclose on your car because you didn't pay your car note this month. You have to pay me right away. I'm giving you a grace period of half an hour. You have to go to the Western Union office and wire, $3,000 to Nigeria, and a lot of them are more subtle than that. And a big one actually now, I don't know if I guess in Russia, you can't use PayPal anymore. But if you've ever used PayPal, you know that when you go to PayPal, sometimes they will send you a code by text, by SMS, that you have to enter into the web interface. So there's an automated social engineering attack that's gaining prominence where a bot calls you and says, hi, this is Fred at PayPal. We have detected unusual activity on your PayPal account. Did you authorize a $3,000 transfer to Nigeria? And you say, well, no. And Fred says, great, I'm glad we caught this. But before I go further, we need to verify your identity. I'm going to send a code to your phone right now, and I need you to read it back to me. But what the hacker is actually doing is trying to log in as you to PayPal. And so at the moment he says, I'm going to send you the code, PayPal sends you that code. And you read it back to Fred. Fred types it in and cleans out your PayPal account.
That kind of attacks are very big in Russia, and we even had an entire episode about this kind of attacks, about social engineering attacks.
Sure. So my point is that there's insider attacks, social engineering, and breaches and vulnerabilities, and that they're often in combination, right? Like you use social engineering to get inside. Once you're inside, you get blackmail data that can recruit an insider. That insider lets you gain a reverse shell, and that lets you attack vulnerabilities, right? Like that what they want is the breach. They're not committed to the method.
Okay, we have established that data is very often leaked, and how is it leaked? But how do criminals use these tools?
So you have toolsmiths. They make tools. Then you have tool users. And so this was a big problem with ransomware, is that you had people who didn't do ransomware. They sold ransomware to people who did ransomware. Yeah. So you have people who are really smart at computers who build the ransomware, and then you have people who are really dumb who use the ransomware and pay a commission. Especially at the start of the ransomware epidemic, you had these crazy things like where I live, just the next town over is North Hollywood. And one of the biggest hospitals in North Hollywood was shut down by a ransomware attack. But it was random, right? They were just going through IP addresses looking for hosts that had vulnerabilities. And then when they contacted the hospital, they said, you must give us $300 or we won't give you back your hospital. And like the people in the hospital were like, we're a hospital, right? Like, guys. And this is one of the things that makes the security very hard, because when the people on the other side are rational actors, right? When they're people who understand what they're going for and are making a calculus, and they're saying like, I'm not going to risk a $200 fine to steal $100. Then you can kind of figure it out, right? Like this is how we make locks. We say, okay, well, this is a lock that will cost $1,000 worth of special equipment to break. So long as the thing inside the safe costs less than $1,000, it'll be fine, right? It's not that the lock is perfect. It's just that like we know that it's better, right? Then sometimes though, you have people who are like, addicted to opioids and desperate, and their minds are addled, and they don't care, right? They're not making good judgments. They're just like, Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada was for a long time, I think it still is, the opioid capital of the Americas. And I was once there to renew my US work visa. And I parked my car in a parking garage in a neighborhood that was full of heroin addicts in Gastown. And I came back half an hour later and I had left 25 cents on the dashboard. And someone had broken my window and stolen 25 cents. In my rental car. It's fine. It was a rental car. But one of the reasons I left 25 cents on the dashboard is I thought nobody rational will break a car window to steal 25 cents. But the people who attacked me weren't rational, right? And so when you have breach tool development concentrated among rational actors who understand the ins and outs and the criminal penalties, but breach tool use being democratized among idiots, then it's very hard to predict where the attacks are going to come. And, so this is one of the things where people say, no one would attack me because I have nothing worth taking.
I'm a small fish, usually people say.
Yeah. Those people are assuming rationality on the part of the attackers, and the attackers are increasingly irrational.
How do criminals convert this data into money? In the end, they want money, right? So is there like a market for that?
Yeah, tons of marketplaces.
So how much does this data cost? Like
the pricing is extremely variable, and it depends on how refined it is. So here's another analogy for you. Where I grew up in Ontario, we produce about half of the world's uranium. And uranium, when you dig it out of the ground, is not dangerous. You can buy uranium on Amazon for science fair projects. They'll just send you, it's mud. When you refine uranium into plutonium, it is very, very dangerous. In fact, it's the most dangerous substance we know about. There's no quantity of uranium that isn't fatal. And you can never turn it back into uranium, right? It's plutonium forever. When you gather an individual piece of data, it's uranium. It's just dirt. My name is Cory Doctorow. It's nothing. When you aggregate that data with lots of other data, it becomes more and more dangerous. And once it's aggregated enough, it will leak because any data you collect will usually leak, and any data, if you retain it long enough, it will definitely leak. And once it leaks, it never goes away, and you can never turn it back into individual pieces. And so how much is the data worth? It depends on how close it is to being plutonium. People pay a lot for plutonium, not much for uranium. If you are selling nude photos hacked from politicians' telephone, it's very valuable, right? If you're selling the data needed to hack nude photos from a politician's telephone, if it's mixed in with 10 million other people's data, it might not be worth very much at all.
Are there any sanctions for the companies which allow data breaches?
The model for this is the GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation. The problems of European federalism are really on display with the GDPR because in general, not always, but in general, you have to bring up a GDPR action in the country where the company is headquartered.
That's really strange. I thought you can file to your local data protection officer.
You can, but they often refer it then to the data protection officer in the country where the firm is domiciled. It's not always true. So there's a guy, Max Schrems, who you may have heard of, who's a genius. Max was he's an Austrian, but he went to an exchange program. He went to law school at Stanford. And while he was there, he was learning about the data that the company stored. And this was before the GDPR, but Europe already had some data protection. And he realized that there was no way that this was legal, and that moreover, the companies had to tell him what data they had on him. So he was a law student. He didn't need to hire lawyers to figure this out because, like, he was one, right?
He's kind of a hacker, but for law.
Yeah. So he said to Facebook and Google, you have to tell me what data you have. And they refused. And he was like, I know you've got a building full of lawyers, but like, I've got nothing better to do. And so he chased them and he chased them and he chased them and he won. And he saw how much data they were collecting. And it was a shocking amount. And it shocked the conscience of European regulators. And it became the basis for the GDPR. And so the GDPR grew out of Max's efforts. And since then, he's created an Austrian nonprofit called NOYB, which stands for None of Your Business. It's a privacy NGO. And they have brought a lawsuit against, I believe it's Facebook, but it might be Google, in Germany, where the data commissioner is very much on the ball. Germany, because of the Stasi in the GDR and the extreme privacy invasions and human rights abuses that they enabled, Germany has a very strong data protection tradition. So he's brought a case, but most of the cases landed in Ireland. Ireland is a tax haven. All the tech companies are based in Ireland. That means that all the privacy claims are heard in Ireland. And because Ireland is dependent on the big tech companies, they don't do anything about it. The Irish data commissioner hears something like 17 cases a year. The German one hears 500 cases a year. Like, basically, the Irish data commissioner doesn't even bother getting out of bed in the morning. That's the problem, right? And I'm kind of unfair to them. I think that they want to do their job. I think what's better to say is that they don't have any resources.
Aren't they paid not to be able to protect you? Like, it's hard to do your job when you're paid not to do your job.
So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw. I don't want to say that they are corrupt, because the people who go into data protection, no one goes into data protection to get rich, right?
True.
Like, if you wanted to help tech companies spy on people, you'd work for a tech company, not for the Irish government. So I think it's more true to say that the reason the Irish government doesn't give the Irish data commissioner the money it needs to do its job is because the Irish government is extremely deferential to multinationals that headquarter in Ireland. And that deferentiality, privacy is only it's just like a sideshow. The main deferentiality is that Ireland doesn't tax them.
Is there a way to store data so it doesn't get breached?
Arguably, yes. Like, I'm not going to be a nihilist and say that you can't ever store data. But what I will say is that perfection is unattainable. And the more data you store, the more an imperfection matters, right? So if you only have a week's worth of records and you get hacked, it means a lot less than if you have 20 years worth of records. So Google, for example, is really good at securing data. But if you have trillions of records and you secure 99.9% of them, then you breach billions of records. And so that's why when Google suffers a small breach, it's a big breach, right? And so this is, I hope, bringing us around to what I think is the most important point, which is data minimization. That the best way to not breach data is to not collect it. And if you must collect it, it's to not retain it. So think back to Amazon, right? Why is Amazon so vulnerable? Because hundreds of teams have made thousands of copies of its internal data in order to do data mining for innovation within the firm. And that act itself, right, the act of aggregating the data and using it a lot makes it vulnerable. Now, could you take all of the data on your hard drive and put it on a thumb drive and encrypt it and remember the key and just put it in a drawer in case your computer got stolen? Now, if you gave that key and the information about where the drive was to 100 people you worked with, we both understand why that's less secure. It doesn't matter how much you trust 100 of your colleagues. One of the things that I think all of us are now thinking about, or should be, is what happens when we get old and die. You know, I have my family photos. I do the household insurance. I have all the policies on my hard drive, right? So I'm also a privacy person and I'm a little paranoid and my hard drive is encrypted and has a big long password and whatever. How do we manage this? So making these succession plans, like figuring out like how much is too much to trust other people. I'll tell you what I did. It's complicated, but I wrote a set of instructions for how to recover my data. And I printed out 2 copies, but without the password. And then I wrote the password in ink by hand. And I gave 1 copy to my friend who's also my boss in San Francisco, who's a lawyer. And I gave another one to a friend of mine who's also a lawyer in London. And I only put half the password on each. If I get hit by a bus and my wife calls these people, they will instantly send her a copy of this paper. That is not a solution that scales, right? Like I understand, but I also started thinking about this 10 years ago. And maybe in 10 years, we will have something probably involving multi-signature keys. There's a thing called Shamir's shared secrets, and it's you can take a key and you can split it into n pieces such that some quorum of them that you can decide arbitrarily can reassemble the key. So you can split a key into 100 pieces, but say that 99 of them are needed, or 9 or 4, you can decide. And so I think that's probably what we'll end up doing, is building multi-signature key recovery systems. Don't require that all of your friends be perfect or alive when you're dead. Yeah. So, you don't have to trust that all of your friends will outlive you and be perfect, and maybe that will work. And so it is possible to store data in secure ways. It requires thoughtfulness.
I also wrote a letter to my wife in case something happens to me, and that was one of the saddest letters I've ever wrote. Like, you start thinking about it.
I didn't write a letter. I just had technical instructions because I couldn't face the sadness of writing the letter. So it is just a set of technical instructions.
Next question. Are there any companies who manage to successfully store data? I think like Apple, maybe.
I mean, I would say they all store some of their data successfully. No, Apple's had breaches too, and they've had insider threats. All of them store some of their data successfully. So the wrong way to think about this is, are they perfect, right? How well do they work? Although that's important because some of them work better than others. Apple has better procedures than Amazon, for example. But it's how well they fail. And how well they fail... so how well they fail is like, how much data do they breach when they breach, which is a function of how much data they've retained. But I want to say one more thing, which is that it doesn't matter how good the security at a firm is unless you trust that firm to be both perfect and always benevolent. And if their shareholders or the law enforcement someday doesn't have your interests, like Apple tells us so much about how much they respect our privacy, and they really do. But in China, Apple removed all the working privacy tools from its app store because the Chinese government said, if you continue to allow users to have VPNs, we're not going to let you make phones in the Pearl River Delta anymore. And Apple said, our shareholders' interest is more important than our Chinese users' interests. And, the same security measure that protects you from bad guys, which is that Apple won't let anyone put something in the App Store unless they approve it, also makes you vulnerable to Apple because you can't put a working VPN in the App Store once Apple says no VPNs go in the App Store.
Let's go into that. Is it possible to build a modern web service or modern company, IT company, without storing personal user data at all?
Depends on what you want to do. Okay, so here's an example. Ad-supported media that's driven by behavioral targeting is either hard or impossible to do. The good news is that there is pretty good evidence that behavioral targeting does not confer much of an advantage. I was going to give an example before when we were talking about targeting of refrigerators. So the median person buys 1 or fewer refrigerators in their whole life. So figuring out how to sell someone a refrigerator is really hard. Most refrigerator ads, if you've seen a refrigerator ad, it was almost certainly on a billboard by an airport. And the thinking behind that is people who fly have money. Refrigerators cost money. Maybe people with money will buy a refrigerator. It's very bad targeting.
There is some logic there, I should say.
Very bad targeting, right? The alternative to behavioral advertising is contextual advertising. If you Google, I am buying a refrigerator,
you will be hunted by these ads till your death.
Yeah, there will be a lot of money in following you around on the web. And the reason people type, I am buying a refrigerator into Google is because they want to read refrigerator reviews, right? Like if you're going to spend $7,000 on a refrigerator, or $10,000 on a refrigerator that you're going to own for 20 years, you're going to read some reviews. So those refrigerator reviews can be covered in refrigerator ads. And that's called contextual advertising. where you advertise based on the context of what the user is doing, not the behavior the user has exhibited. That's the great shift that you would have. So can you have advertising supported media without behavioral tracking? Not only can you, but it would put more money and more power in the hands of publishers. So like we can absolutely not spy on people. Now, can you build a Fitbit without spying on people? Well, it'll be a very different Fitbit, right? Your Fitbit could spend a lot of time telling you about what you're doing, but it would have a very hard time comparing you to other people.
I'm thinking about more mundane things like Messenger, for example.
Yeah.
What about them?
So I think that you can definitely build a messenger that is end-to-end encrypted. There's a big question right now about whether you could build an interoperable messenger. You know, people say, oh, I hate this technology company I use. I don't like Facebook, but I still use Facebook. I must be addicted to it. Because that's our paradigm, right? If you use something and you can't stop using it, you must be addicted. It must be like cigarettes. I don't think there's any evidence that people are addicted to Facebook. I think what they have on Facebook is all of their friends. And the problem of figuring out how everybody leaves Facebook at once and goes somewhere else, unless, you know, Vladimir Putin orders them out of the country, right?
That didn't work because everyone installed VPNs.
Yeah, of course. So the problem of moving to another service is very hard. And that's economists, they call that the switching costs. And one way you can lower the switching costs is with interoperability. So if you could go to a rival service, but you could exchange messages with Facebook, then, you know, on the one hand, like Facebook might treat you better because they know that you can leave and not have to leave behind your friends. And also, on the other hand, if they didn't, you could leave and you wouldn't have to be under Facebook's, you know, moderation and its policies. And so, there's like a good reason to want interoperable services.
Do you think interoperability could be forced by law?
Well, that's what the Digital Markets Act is trying to do in the European Union. And, you know, we have lots of precedent. One of the things that we got after the breakup of AT&T was mandatory interoperability to allow, for example, for third-party long-distance carriers to plug into AT&T's network. Getting back to your question, like over collection, under collection, could you still run these services? There is information that Facebook collects for the purposes of trying to recommend content to you. There's information that Facebook collects for the purpose of trying to show ads to you. And then there's information that Facebook collects because there's no reason not to collect it and they might think of something to do with it later. And the question is, like, how many of those things do you value as a user? And I think all of us as users do not value the prospective uses of our data that haven't been invented yet. You know, maybe there's a few of us who still think Mark Zuckerberg is a genius and are like, I want him to have all my data because he's just going to come up with the coolest idea. I think most of those people are these days worshiping Elon Musk and not Mark Zuckerberg, but whatever. I don't think anybody wants ads. Facebook doesn't need to collect your data to show you ads. They just need to analyze what you're looking at to show you ads.
Cory, there is one example I was thinking is Signal. So any other companies who do something like that, like minimizing data to the end, where they have just the one bit of information?
You know, there are a bunch of like things that you use that are not services, that are products that don't collect any data. Like for email, I use Thunderbird. And I run my own mail server, which not a thing most people do. But I run my own mail server and it doesn't collect any data. And I use what's called POP, which is a way of getting your mail so that it's deleted from the server and only lives on your computer. It's a problem because, like, I went to my kid's dance recital yesterday and they said, oh, we emailed you the ticket. Can't you get it on your phone? And I'm like, no, I don't. My email is like 100 gigabytes. I don't have my email on my phone because there's only like one copy of my email. It's like on my laptop and then backed up. So I'm recording this conversation right now with Audacity, and I'm going to send you the FLAC when we're done. So Audacity doesn't collect it. So there are a lot of products that don't gather any data, including ones that communicate over networks like Google, or like email rather. I mean, the problem of email is that data collection is a team sport. And this is why just relying on personal choices is not enough. Because even though I've run my own mail server, I encrypt my email, I use PGP, and it doesn't stay on the server, it goes on my hard drive. My hard drive is encrypted and no one has the password except me. But everybody I send email to is using unencrypted email on Gmail or Yandex or whatever, right? And so all that email is just sitting on Google's server. So this is why if you're going to keep your email from being retained, it needs to be on both sides of the equation.
In Russia, there is a law which dictates that all communication provider companies should give a direct access to the user data in case of the investigation. Do governments have access to all the data which is stored by the companies?
They sort of do, right? So what they have is a propensity for asking overreaching data requests that are illegal under constitutional law. One of the things that makes a government trustworthy is if it abides by the rule of law. And the problem has been, and the problem that, Snowden revealed, is that the government was not abiding by the rule of law. So you had this double combination, this double problem, where governments were asking for more data than they were legally entitled to. And they were doing so in a way that made it non-transparent and non-accountable. That made the companies, it put them in a position where I think a lot of them were more likely to give in to government requests because they had a sense that there was no point in fighting, that the people wouldn't know, they couldn't tell the people. One of our first important cases at the Electronic Frontier Foundation was representing an ISP that wanted to tell the world that it had gotten one of these secret search warrants, because the warrant was secret, and then information about the warrant was secret. They couldn't even say that they'd gotten a warrant, right? And we won. We won the right to disclose this. And so I think governments over request data, and I think it's not an accident that they do it. I think that one of the things that governments actually quite like is having commercial arrangements with data collectors. So, when we ask, how is it that the US doesn't have a federal privacy law? Well, one of the great customers of US data brokers is the US government and US law enforcement agencies, because the Fourth Amendment, the constitutional right to privacy, covers them going to a company and ordering it to turn over its information. But if the company is selling the information, then there's no constitutional protection. And, the company can only sell the information if it's legal. And the only people who can make it illegal are the government agencies that depend on it. That there was this thing called a program called PRISM, which was a means of requesting mass data transfers from big tech companies to the NSA. But then what we found out, and this is when the tech companies got so angry, is that they had a thing called upstream. So the tech companies had fiber links between their data centers, and they weren't encrypting the data on the fiber links. And so it turned out that the way that the NSA would do this is they would look at all the traffic between all the data centers. And if they found someone they were interested in, they would then go to the tech companies and say, we've got an anonymous tip that this guy's a drug dealer or whatever. Can you give us their data? And then they would go after the guy. So they didn't want the tech companies to find out that they were wiretapping data centers themselves. So PRISM was just, it was a show, right? It was a show for the tech companies, right? So that the tech companies wouldn't go, wait a second, how are they getting all this information from our data centers? So the NSA would already have the information. They just go ask for it so that the tech companies would think that they got it because they were collaborating with the NSA, not because the NSA had hacked them. So this is when the tech companies got really angry at the NSA.
They care about their privacy, right?
Yeah, well, they care about their privacy, and they thought if they collaborated, that as they said, I think gentlemen do not read each other's mail. So this is why trustworthiness and trusted are so important, because it dictates the actual, to use a word from the Cold War, the realpolitik of what data can be requested and how.
I want to wrap up with some practical questions for our audience. So we've talked about it at length about that you are not safe on the internet, that you are spied upon by anyone who cares. It seems like everyone is trying to store as much data as possible. Is there a way to be on the internet without being tracked and cataloged?
There is. You can be very, very, very cautious, right? You can do the things that I do, which is using VPNs operated by companies that you trust, and then hoping that your trust was right, and then encrypting your email and using Signal and, encrypting your hard drive and all of those things. But remember the attacker's advantage. Someday you'll make a mistake. Ultimately, the only way to do this is to have the rule of law. So going back to trustworthy and trusted governments, and I know that this is a tough message to give to people. In Russia, the rule of law is your best hedge against it, and it's imperfect, as is technology. And in technology, we have this idea called defense in depth, where you don't just rely on one system to protect you. You have encryption and privacy, you have the rule of law and constitution, you have mobility and the ability to leave. All of those things together They make you more secure, but no one of them works on its own. At Electronic Frontier Foundation, we have a project called Street Level Surveillance. It's in Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages, and it describes steps that you can take to make yourself more secure in high stakes situations like the ones that many people in Russia find themselves in. And we also published a guide to using Telegram with specific contextual notes for people in Ukraine and people in Russia.
My last question is about popular web services. You said that there is a guide from the EFF, and I will link it in the description of this episode. But are there any more tips for people using popular web services like Facebook or Instagram or whatever? Can you use them in a way that data breaches do not affect me? Can I use them in such a way?
I wish the answer was yes, but I don't think it is. I mean, yes, we should all be thoughtful about what we share. Of course. But sharing is important. Oh, my family in St. Petersburg, I haven't seen them in many years, and I don't know when I'll see them again. Sharing with them is really important, right? It's like this is how we stay connected with each other. And, I don't want to say, just get off the internet. And it's not enough to be thoughtful. Although we should be thoughtful, it's not enough to be thoughtful because, as I've said, the unexpected ways in which breach data can be mixed with deliberately disclosed data presents real risks. You can't and won't anticipate all the ways that this could happen. And one of the pathologies of talking about this stuff is to blame users for oversharing and not anticipating risk.
It's like blaming not plastic companies, but the people who buy bottles.
People who use them for plastic. Yeah. What are you going to do? Carry the water around like this? So yeah, I think that you won't be able to anticipate it all. And that's the point, is you shouldn't have, that's not a risk that we manage individually. That is a risk that has to be managed collectively through a good and accountable government.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much. It was a great honor to have you, and thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Samat.